Hi, sir.
How are you?
Good. How are
See
you?
you.
Very nice. Very nice.
Thank you.
I gave your team a
I have
little
all the
warning.
fun, man.
Mr. Pescarell asked about the EDR issue.
Okay.
He thinks it's part of the whole matter. Slap it. Subcommittee will come to order. Good afternoon, everybody. So we're going to begin. I'm really excited to finally be having this hearing. When I came to Congress back in 2001, the Sustainable Growth Rate, or SGR as we all know it by, provision in the Balanced Budget Act of 1997 was in the process of being implemented. And under this payment formula, any yearly increase in per beneficiary spending that exceeded growth in GDP could result in a negative adjustment for physician payment in Medicare. Dr. Price was really well aware of that. Clearly, this policy or the math didn't work, and for the next 15 years, we had almost yearly struggles over what was aptly named the doc fix. 17 of these doc fixes later takes us to last March when we came together in a bipartisan fashion with stakeholder input and CMS technical support to pass the Medicare Access and CHIP Reauthorization Act of 2015, or now commonly known as MACRA, with nearly 400 votes in the House. This legislation finally put an end to the sustainable growth rate so that doctors could focus on patient care and not worry about unpredictable payments. We've called this hearing today to take our first look at the regulations released by CMS on April 27th. We will look closely at how these regulations match up with congressional intent and what our members and CMS are hearing from stakeholders as they digest 950-plus pages of regulations. That's the scope of the hearing, to discuss the implementation of this truly historic legislative feat, and there's a lot in the proposed rule to discuss. So I know that on a bipartisan basis, we're going to dive in a deep way. Furthermore, I'd like to take a moment to encourage members of both sides of the aisle, as you hear from stakeholders and constituents regarding concerns or thoughts about the proposed rule, please bring them to the attention of the bipartisan committee staff so that we can continue to do robust oversight and keep CMS up to date on the information as they formulate their final regulation. The passage of MACRA last year confirmed our commitment on both sides of the aisle to keep Medicare strong for America's seniors. This is particularly important to me, as well as many of you, especially after we just celebrated Mother's Day, as both my parents back in my district in Ohio depend on this important Medicare program. By replacing the way that physicians are paid and consolidating the separate quality measurement systems, we have taken a great step toward the ultimate goal of fully integrated value-based care through the incentivization of high-quality care. Now our role as Congress is to provide oversight and in conjunction with CMS to provide education on how this new law will work for the various types of clinicians and provider groups. We need to answer how this rule will affect individual and small group providers versus larger groups. How will this rule affect specialty groups versus primary care physicians? How will the timing work for implementation under some potentially tight timelines? These are questions that I hope to get clarity on today and going forward through the implementation process. As we move forward with implementation, I want to make sure that we as Congress recognize some very important facts regarding the law that we passed. The Merit-Based Incentive Payment System, or MIPS, was created as a budget-neutral program. High-quality, value-based care will take effort, but as I've said before, such efforts must be recognized within the environmental and timing factors based in reality. And additionally, the thresholds for providers to qualify as advanced alternative payment models are high and are set in statute. Working on a bipartisan basis with stakeholders from every corner of our country and an open dialogue and cooperation from CMS will allow us to follow MACRA into the next generation of value-based healthcare. Now we can go to work. With that, I'd like to yield to the distinguished ranking member, Dr. McDermott, for the purposes of an opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Tiberi. When Medicare was put in place some 50 years ago, a critical decision was made by the Medical Association in order to have them join in the effort. And they demanded that they be paid their usual and customary fees. And we on this committee have been, since that time, trying to get back the keys to the Treasury. This is another effort here. Now, the proposal by MACRA, or the MACRA rule from CMS, is really as a result of our efforts, as Mr. Tiberi says, of 15 years of realizing what we put in place didn't work. It took us 15 years to figure out that we ought to try and do something different. Now, I hope this is the beginning of a constructive, bipartisan conversation about how to advance our shared goal of controlling costs and improving the delivery of health care in the country. Passing MACRA was a tremendous bipartisan accomplishment in that it put an end to a cycle of dysfunction. We had the same thing happen every year. We're going to have a 20% cut in doctor's pay. So there'd be a big rush around here, and we'd put a patch on it. And then we'd go on for another year, and next year it'd be a 24% cut in doctor's pay, and we'd put a patch on it. We did that again and again. For years, we lurched from crisis to crisis, and to avoid what were draconian cuts in the physician's payment. We ended up by spending more on those temporary delays than it would have cost to do away with the SGR in the beginning. But last year, we put an end to this cycle once and for all by passing MACRA. It was a tremendous step forward, as MACRA is much more than just a simple repeal of SGR. It's also the most significant payment reform the Medicare program has seen in years. Thanks to MACRA, we've set Medicare on a more sustainable course that will allow us to pay for volume in healthcare, or excuse me, value in healthcare rather than volume. The law modernizes and streamlines physicians' payment. Instead of a patchwork of incentives and alternative payment models, it consolidates various programs into a single framework. It will allow flexibility for providers that will allow them to practice medicine independently while still holding them accountable for providing high-value care. These are complicated issues, and we are still in the early stages of digesting this proposed rule. It's big enough, it'll take a while. But what we've seen so far has been encouraging. The administration has worked diligently to implement the law as intended through a process that is responsive to the needs of the public. The proposed rule is consistent with the goals of MACRA. It provides flexibility to participate in either the merit-based incentive payment program or alternative payment methods that reward high-value care. This will make sure providers do not end up in a one-size-fits-all approach and it doesn't make sense for them or their patients. It is the product of an open and transparent process that began months ago through active outreach, consideration of extensive comments, and public workshops with stakeholders. The agency has heard from a range of viewpoints, and the proposal reflects careful consideration of that input. I'm confident the administration will continue to be responsive to the needs of the public as it develops the final rule. This is an ongoing conversation. We still have much more to learn as we work toward our shared goal of making the implementation of this landmark law a success. Getting people covered by health care is one thing. Controlling the costs is another thing. And this is about controlling the costs and I don't believe we've got our arms around it yet, but we're in the process, and that's why we welcome you here, Mr. Slavitt, to make this presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. McDermott. Without objection, other members' opening statements will be made part of the record. Today's witness panel includes just one expert, and we're lucky to have him. Andy Slavitt, Acting Administrator at the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, who along with his colleagues have the daunting task of implementing this very important law. On a personal note, thank you for having me at your office yesterday. It was nice to get to know you and members of your team and look forward to continuing dialogue in the future. With that, Mr. Slavitt, please proceed with your testimony, and we appreciate you being here today.
Thank you, Chairman Teebury, Ranking Member McDermott, members of the subcommittee, and thank you for the opportunity to discuss CMS's work to implement the Medicare Access and CHIP Reauthorization Act of 2015. We greatly appreciate your leadership in passing this important law, which gives us a unique opportunity to move away from the annual uncertainty created by the sustainable growth rate to a new system that promotes quality, coordinated care for patients, and sets the Medicare program on a more sustainable path. Our number one priority is patient care. And thanks to Congress, MACRA streamlined the patchwork of programs that currently measure value and quality into a single framework called the Quality Payment Program, where every physician and clinician has the opportunity to be paid more for providing better care for their patients. In recognition of the diversity of physician practices, Congress created two paths. The first allows physicians and other clinicians a new flexibility to participate in a single, simplified program with lower reporting burden and new flexibility in delivering quality care. The second path recognizes that physicians and clinicians who choose to take a further step towards care coordination by participating in more advanced models like medical homes. Our goal is to make both of these paths flexible, transparent, and simple so physicians can focus on patient care, not reporting or scorekeeping. We've approached this implementation with the belief that physicians know best how to provide high-quality care to our beneficiaries. And we've taken an unprecedented effort to draft a proposal that is based directly on input from those in the front line of care delivery. We've reached out and listened to over 6,000 stakeholders, including state medical societies, physician groups, and patient groups, to understand how the changes we're proposing may positively impact care and how to avoid unintended consequences. The feedback we received shaped our proposal in important ways, and the dialogue is continuing. Based on what we learned, our approach to implementation is being guided by three principles. First, patients are and must remain the key focus. Financial incentives should work in the background to support physician and clinician efforts to provide the highest quality care and create incentives for more coordinated care. Second, we're focused on adopting approaches that can be driven at the practice level, not one size fits all from Washington. It will be important to allow physicians to define the measures of care most fitting with their patients. Third, we must aim for simplicity in everything we do. Physician practices are already busy, and we are seeking every opportunity possible to minimize distractions from patient care by reducing, automating, and streamlining existing programs. Among the many places that we seek feedback during the comment period, this is among the most important, as the burdens on small and rural practices in particular have increased over the last several years. One of the important opportunities will be for physicians to define and propose new payment models so that we can create an array of customized approaches that reflects the diversity of care across the country, and particularly as it relates to the various specialties that provide care. Congress had the foresight to create a formal voice for physicians through the Physician-Focused Payment Model Technical Advisory Committee. I had the opportunity to meet with them last week and can tell you that they are very eager to move forward with their important work, and we are eager to work with them. With all the work that went into this proposal, it is critical that we receive direct feedback from physicians and other stakeholders and are undertaking significant outreach efforts. Our proposed rule is the first step in a process, and we look forward to receiving and reviewing comments to refine and improve our approach. In the month of May alone, We have 35 scheduled events and listening sessions to hear from a wide range of stakeholders, and this outreach will remain an important part of our work. I personally have been meeting regularly with physician groups, including smaller and rural practices, and have spoken to thousands of physicians in different parts of the country about their work, the opportunities and challenges they face, and what this proposal means for them and their patients. Throughout this, I have appreciated the open dialogue with this subcommittee and the larger committee, and it is clear to me that we share the goals of creating a more sustainable system with smarter spending and that keeps people healthier. We're striving to do just that in the implementation of MACRA, but it will take work and broad participation to get it right. I look forward to hearing your further thoughts on this implementation and to answering your questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Slavitt. As you know, in my district, I represent urban, suburban, rural, and most of the concerns I've heard with respect to MACRA and the future implementation of MACRA is from small and rural providers, practices. So the proposed regulation assigns 3 levels of risk required for entities participating in the APMs, the alternative payment models. And what I've not seen are any tiers or variabilities in the amount of risk for participation between an individual and small group clinician and large group clinicians. Have you heard concern from providers about this?
So thank you for the question. I think the topic of particularly small practices and making sure that they can succeed is of utmost importance. And our data shows that physicians that are in small and solo practices, so long as they report, can do just as well as physicians in larger size practices. So we know, however, that there is a burden on us to make the reporting as easy as possible. We also know there are a number of other steps that we need to be looking for and looking out for to make sure we make things as easy as possible and accommodate smaller practices. So importantly, we are looking for additional steps and ideas as people review the rules, but I will say that we are focusing on technical assistance, providing access through medical home models, opportunities to report in groups, and using a reporting process that automatically feeds data, reduces the number of measures, and overall lowers the burden for small practices.
So in a follow-up to that and reading through the regulation, there are several areas that seem to allow a little more flexibility for individual and small group practices. Can you outline some of the major differences in reporting for individual and small group practices versus the larger groups that could maybe ease the burden or send that message to the smaller groups that there's sensitivity there?
Sure, absolutely. So first of all, at the request of the physicians, we met with a lot of physicians and physician groups and small practices in this process. One of their key requests was that if they're already participating in something like a clinical registry or some other way of getting data across, it may be an accountable care organization or clinical registry, that we use that information rather than requiring them to send them again. And our proposal does indeed allow this, multiple ways for us to get information. Secondly, we're required to measure the cost of care, and we are going to be able to do that automatically by getting a claims feed. So that's going to require physicians to send us no information whatsoever. And then there are a number of areas where they'll simply need to attest to whether they're doing a certain activity, which we think will reduce the burden. And we're looking more broadly at the overall experience for physicians. Small physicians can report in groups in many categories where they hadn't been able to before. And then finally, I'd say there are a large number of physicians who won't have to report at all because they'll be underneath the minimum threshold. And Congress put forward that if physicians don't see enough Medicare patients or enough amount through Medicare, that they don't have to report at all. So all of those things, I think, are there. And again, we also look for additional steps if there are some that we can take.
Just final thought, and I don't mean to put you on the spot on this, but do you think there's any more that we can do, those of us on this side of the dais and you and your team at CMS, that we could do to ensure that as we lay the foundation for MACRA going forward and there's buy-in, complete buy-in from the physician community that the system is not built with an inherent fairness or fairness issues. Again, going back to the rural provider or the two-person provider group that has a bunch of angst right now, as this has begun to unfold. Is there any more that we can do, or you can do, or we can work together on?
Yeah, I think it's got to be a vital, continuous effort. Last week I met with small physician practices from Southern Arkansas, Southern Oregon, New Jersey. We have a meeting on Friday with Rural Health Association at their annual meeting. We went out to Kansas City last week to meet with the Family Practice Association. And we do hear a lot from small physicians who are concerned, and I think they're particularly concerned if people in Washington are making centralized decisions that are going to impact their quality of care. And what they tell us over and over again, and we need to keep talking to them and getting more feedback, is give us the freedom to take care of these patients. We know how to do it. Let us define quality. Let us select the measures that are right for our practice. Give us more flexibility, and don't make us focus on reporting. Let us focus on patient care. And it's really critical, I think, as we work together and as you hear input, that you get this to us and that we hold ourselves very much to that standard that physicians across the country are holding us to.
Thank you, sir. With that, I recognize Dr. McDermott for 5 minutes.
Thank you. One of the issues that the questions Mr. Tiberi is raising about small practices sort of leads me to the question of consolidation and driving doctors together in larger and larger groups. The question then comes in my mind. I practice both as an individual and in the military and in a group practice, so I've been in all sorts of forms. One of the things that strikes me that is going to be difficult to deal with here is the whole question of what is the best care. If you have a large organization and they have an MRI and they don't want to use it, or they want to use it, they can crank through a lot of people through it with MRI for everything. Or they can say, don't use an MRI, and there will be patients out there who do not benefit from what they could find. I can give you an example of a young woman, 34 years old, who had pain in her back and was told it was, you're riding a bicycle and there's a lot of reasons why, you're young and blah, blah, blah. At 35, they did an MRI and found a tumor in her spine. Now, if they'd done that, they would have found it 5 years earlier. But the organization was encouraging people not to use. So how are we going to make our judgment about whether we've got quality of care if the major factor is going to be money? I mean, what's built into this to actually look at the quality of care?
Yeah. So I think that at the heart of the question, the most important thing above all else is making sure patients get high quality care. And we do believe that if patients are getting high quality care, that's going to lead to better cost control, because if someone gets the right surgery, they won't need to have a second surgery. Likewise, if somebody has the quality is also defined as making sure the care is coordinated. So if somebody needs to have a follow-up visit or has a prescription or something that is an instruction, that they understand what that is, it's explained to them, and that the system works and supports them. So our job here is to enforce that, number one. Number two, I think our job isn't to define quality here ourselves as much as it is to take the best standards of care that the specialists and the physicians around the country have defined as quality, and make sure that we keep up with that, and that we keep those measures as the things that physicians decide as a group that they should be measured on, and those are the things. And then third, as I said earlier, that at the practice, things actually differ at the practice level. And we believe that practices, by and large, are the people that know best for what's right with their patients, and the dialogue between the patient and the physician. So nothing we're doing should be seen to be interfering with that in any way. And in fact, we ought to be reinforcing those things, and I think macro gives us the opportunity to say, if you're delivering a better quality care outcome for your patient, you ought to be rewarded for that.
You're suggesting the whole question of evidence-based medicine. That is, I've been to the doctor recently, and they send out from the University of Washington a sheet to me, and it says, did you have good care? Well, was he polite? Was he nicely dressed? And blah, blah, blah. Down at the bottom, were you satisfied with your care? Now, for some people, if they don't get a prescription, or they don't get an x-ray, or they don't get a blood test, or they don't get something, the doctor hasn't done anything.
Right.
So how do you measure then the patient who says, well, I wasn't satisfied because I went away and I still got my sinuses are a mess and he didn't give me antibiotics. How do you deal with that issue in the quality of care?
Sure. I think one of the nice things is, I'll give you an example. I was sitting down with some physicians from that are practicing medicine in southern rural Arkansas. I referred to them recently. They are in one of these models, a medical home model, where they have a per member per month payment they get in order to coordinate the care. And they've hired care coordinators. And what they told me was, a physician I was talking to told me, he said, is now I actually can get paid to practice medicine the way that I'm supposed to practice medicine, instead of practicing medicine the right way and getting paid on something completely different. So I think the more we evolve our healthcare system to a way that reinforces what physicians know are the right things to do in delivering quality care to patients, the better off we're going to be, as opposed to a system where if you don't make a cut in someone's skin or give them a prescription or something that they leave the office with, that's not success.
I have a medical home at the University of Washington. Thank you.
Thanks to Dr. McDermott. That was really good. We agree on something. So, Ms. Slavitt, thanks so much. I've got 12 different questions I could ask you on 12 different topics, and my mom has one that she shared with me last night she wanted me to ask you. But it doesn't have to do with MACRA, so that's for another day, and I would like to remind all members to try to keep the topic to this important law that we passed. With that, Mr. Johnson is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Slavitt, welcome. You've said that CMS is working to regain the hearts and minds of physicians through implementation of MACRA. And that's great, because many physicians in solo and small practices have really struggled to stay afloat in recent years. And while there are a lot of good things in the proposed rule, I have one issue I'd like to raise with you. I'm concerned by the estimates in Table 64, where CMS projects the greatest negative impact on payments to practices with 9 or fewer doctors, and the least harm to large systems with 100 or more docs. If CMS is trying to win back the hearts and minds of physicians, this proposal falls short, since it will continue to push physicians out of their solo or small practices. Can you tell me specifically what CMS is doing to ensure that solo practitioners and small groups can succeed under the MIPS and participate in alternative payment models by 2019?
Thank you, Congressman Johnson, for the question. And I really will actually welcome the opportunity to address this table, and for anyone who hasn't seen the table is designed to estimate what the impact of these regulations could be on practices of various size. And the first thing I want to make very clear is that the question of making sure that small groups and solo practitioners can be successful is of utmost importance. And I would also indicate that despite what that table shows, our data shows that physicians who are in small and solo practices can do just as well, and actually do just as well, as physicians that are in practices that are larger than that. Now, the reason that table looks the way it does is for one very simple and important reason, is it counts for the fact that in 2014, when the data uses, most physicians in small and solo practices, many, did not even report on their quality. And this is important for a couple reasons. First of all, I should say that in 2015 and subsequent years, the reporting went up. So at best, this table would be very, very conservative. And of course, as I explained to Chairman Tiberi, reporting is going to get far easier going forward. But it does point to a couple of things that I think we'd be wise to pay attention to. One, making sure that it's as easy as possible for physicians to report. One of the reasons why we don't have the hearts and minds of physicians is because there's just too much paperwork in healthcare.
I would agree.
They need to be practicing medicine, not doing paperwork. So there has been a tremendous amount of effort so far, and this is just a proposal. So this next period of time for comments are a time when we are hoping people can give us even further ideas and further ways that we can reduce the administrative and reporting burden. But to be very clear, there's absolutely every opportunity, and in fact an equal opportunity, for small and solo practices to be successful.
Well, thank you. Maybe we better indoctrinate the nurses too. Don't they do most of that? Hey, I thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back my time.
Thank you, Mr. Johnson. Mr. Kine is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Slavitt, for your testimony here today. Needless to say, I think Congress, in passing MACRA, gave you a huge undertaking. And now with the 900-page rule, I think it's pretty obvious that we're going to need to keep the lines of communication open, and hopefully your outreach with the stakeholder groups will continue, as it has been, not just physicians, but patient feedback as well. I know many members of this committee, myself concluded, have been pushing hard to move to a more integrated, coordinated healthcare delivery system. I come from a region of the country in Wisconsin that have established models of care and been pushing aggressively in this direction for quite some time. And then ultimately, alternative payment methods, so we get to quality, value-based, outcome-based reimbursements. And again, that is kind of the directive that MACRA gave you. But also, a lot of my providers were early-stage, first-generation ACO models. My question is, what more can be done in order to provide an on-ramp for advanced APM payments to those early-stage ACOs? Or are they going to have to just leapfrog and go on to Gen 2, Gen 3, Gen 4?
Yeah. So you're raising a very important question, which is where physicians have an opportunity. As we mentioned, all physicians in every program will have the opportunity to get rewarded for quality care. But where physicians have an opportunity to, and have had the opportunity over the last several years, to join with other physicians in these more coordinated care models, the medical home would be one example. We think those are a good idea. We think they're a good idea if they're right for the physician, if the physician think they make sense for their patients. And of course, it creates an opportunity in its own right to earn more. What MACRA does is it gives physicians even an additional opportunity, and an opportunity to earn 5% additional bonus on top of what they may already be earning in these advanced models. So the question is, what's the requirement to get access to that 5% bonus? And the legislation puts forward a number of requirements, and the requirement really, in a nutshell, if I were going to simplify it, is that there has to be a higher degree of shared accountability from the physician, and that shared accountability is shared accountability for the outcome to the patient, and a minimal sharing of the cost with the Medicare program itself. So in other words, in order to qualify for this 5% bonus, I think the words that are in the legislation are there has to be more than a nominal risk. So our job in putting this regulation together is to put the definition around what is that nominal risk. We've tried to do that in as consistent a way as possible and as simple a way as possible, but really it's one of the areas where we're really inviting feedback. And then all of our models, whatever model we're in, we'll have to qualify based upon that definition. And so even if a physician is in a model that doesn't qualify because there's not as much nominal risk, there's still great opportunities, and there's still opportunities for them to grow into other models.
Yeah, well, finally, the great cost driver in our society is true at the federal level with our budget, at state and local, for families and businesses alike, a rising healthcare cost. So with the direction this rule is taking, can we sit here with reasonable confidence that this may ultimately lead to some cost savings, but without jeopardizing the outcome or quality of care that our patients are receiving? Or is this going to turn into a Lake Wabigon type of situation where everyone's above average, everyone's qualifying for bonus payments, and there's no real cost savings at the end of the day.
Right. Well, I think, first of all, I think we all are striving for a higher quality healthcare system. We all want our money spent more wisely, and we don't want to do it in a way that people feel like they're skimping on their care. We have 10,000 new seniors every day in America, and our jobs are to be able to figure out how to take care of them better for less money. And that means being able to take care of them in lower cost settings, more comfortable settings like their homes, rather than in institutions like hospitals. And so those types of incentives are vital to this program. Within the regulation, the pool balances out, and so we're going to have to allocate money and have upward and downward adjustments as part of this program in order to be able to meet the sustainability test that you talked about. That's nothing new. There are upward and downward adjustments in programs today. What is new is that this will be a simpler, more aligned and program that's easier to measure and take tack of.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Ruscombe is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I've got an observation, a point, and a nudge. My observation is this. There's a level of anxiety that's out there in our public life today because people look at Congress and they say nothing's happening. And yet here we've got this issue where both sides of the aisle, the White House, everybody came together, wrestled a very complicated issue to the ground, came up with a solution, and it doesn't involve snarling at one another on television. It doesn't involve, hyperbole and so forth, but there was this very serious effort, and we're on the verge of, I think, some good things. So just a little shout out, and that is 3 cheers for something getting done, and I think there's an encouraging element to that. My point is that debate matters. I would argue that one of the reasons that we were able to have that discussion when Speaker Boehner and Leader Pelosi were able to come together, and the two of them really drove the discussion, it was because it had been well wrestled through in the United States over the past several years that we need to do something on Medicare. And both sides have different views of the world and so forth, but there was, it had become normalized in that sense that these things had to change. So debate does matter, and I think we are better off if our debate doesn't involve snarling at one another, and it's to various points, but debate matters because debate is a prelude to action. Margaret Thatcher said, first you win the debate, then you win the vote. Okay, now here's the nudge. And this is the nudge for you, Mr. Slavitt. One of the things that I think you and I have talked about offline, and you've alluded to some of this too a minute ago, there is this tension that's out there. And there's a tension that manifests it, and let me just tell you a quick story. So I served in the state legislature, and we had some education testing issues that came before us. And you know how this works. There's always a new test. There's always a new standard. So I called a friend of mine who's an old friend from high school who is a high school administrator. And I said, give me the straight scoop on these tests. And he said, Peter, look, will you just pick a test and stick with it and not change it every 4 years? And he goes, we're happy to be accountable, but stick with the test, stick with the program. And that deeply resonated with me. So the tension is that I think healthcare providers want a standard. They want something that's predictable. But now also the tension is they don't want something that's declarative and dispositive and can never be revisited, because that's big and that's overwhelming, and that's what SGR had, that's what we had to do for, the doc fix for all those years. That was declarative, it was an over characterization, and it failed. And the proof that it failed was we all had to kick the can down the road. So my nudge is this. As you are going through and you're figuring this out, and I really appreciate the disposition and the attitude and the open rule time that you have now and the comments that you're taking in, if you could really be mindful of those smaller practices that Mr. Johnson mentioned. The point that Mr. McDermott made, and that is, how is it that a physician that is maybe stewarding antibiotics correctly or not giving in to patient pressure for a prescription, how is that physician protected. And also, I hadn't thought about it until Mr. Kine mentioned it, and that is are the bonus payments, so to speak, are they simply a new floor? And does the average become the expectation? So all of those, you know, I'm here, and I think that the chairman has set the great tone here, and that is to try for us to listen and to learn. But as you're navigating through those natural tensions of having something that can be predictable, but also maintaining that level of flexibility where it can be revisited and changed, I think is the best of both worlds. And with that, you don't need to respond. I'll yield back. Thank you.
If you'd like to respond, you may. It's up to you.
We had these conversations, including a little bit yesterday. I think this idea of making sure that people don't feel like the game is changing on them mid-course is critical. So there is enough in this legislation that allows us to tell folks going in, hey, here's how it works, and advance. I think there's nothing more frustrating than being told after you took the test how it's being graded. And then I think you make an important point as well, which is how do you trade off making sure you're predictable with staying current with the state of the art of the state of medicine and what physicians are saying that they want. And I think we have a process for that. We take comment on that process. We think it's an effective process, but it's also important that physicians have the flexibility to navigate the process, particularly at different times in their practice.
Thank you. Mr. Thompson is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for having the hearing today. Thank you, sir, for being here. I'm sorry I had to step out, so I hope I'm not going to be repetitive here. But we're all very, very interested. I think you can tell by the tone of all the questions that this law works. We have a very vested interest in that, not only as the Committee of Jurisdiction, but also these are the people, providers and patients that we represent at home, and we want to make sure that it works. And so to that end, I'd like to hear what the administration is doing to help providers get ready ahead of the 2017 start date, and what would you recommend providers be doing to get ready? And is there anything that we, as members of Congress, should be doing to help facilitate this transition?
Yeah, thank you. So I guess maybe I will start to direct that question as if what I would say to a physician who is wondering, what does this all mean? And it's a conversation that I get to have frequently because I've been having a lot of conversations with physicians. And I think there's probably 5 things I would say that I would keep in mind as a physician, or from I think, our perspective. Number 1, and most importantly, keep focusing on your patients and on patient care. Don't worry about the scorekeeping. It will be our job to put this forward in a way where it becomes easier, and indeed it will be easier and more streamlined than the processes that people have to go through today. So that's the good news, and that's the first thing. The second thing is that we have to continue to talk to people and educate people. Is there opportunity, as the chairman's question implied earlier, is it that because physicians will have the opportunity to decide which measures and which ways of measuring quality they want to be measured on, that at some point they'll begin to think about what those things are, and they'll be able to put those in motion. And that's really one of the important early things. I think if there are opportunities to participate in these more advanced models, these care coordination models like medical homes, they should obviously consider those because there are some extra rewards for that. But it won't be until the spring of 2018 that physicians would first need to report on MACRA. And so it's important that they not get too concerned about that. And then the final thing I'd say, and I think we're trying to encourage for everybody, is to provide us feedback. During this comment period, we really want physicians to be able to review this. We're setting up a number of sessions. I talked to 3,000 physicians yesterday on a call. We do twice-a-week webinars to get your questions answered and then give us feedback on how you think this is going to affect your practice.
And as far as us being able to do anything to help facilitate the transition, any comments for the committee?
I think the more listening sessions and open forums that there can be with physicians and giving physicians an opportunity not just to hear what's in the rule, but to tell us how it's going to impact them. I spoke with one of the members of the subcommittee who asked me to participate in one of those sessions with people in his district. I think we have a lot of the staff at CMS that are available to do phone calls and other things to reach out directly. So let us know what you're hearing from your constituents, and our job is to be responsive.
And so in my particular case, would you rather do a phone call into the Napa Valley, or would you rather come out and do it in person? I yield back.
Maybe a future subcommittee hearing. Dr. Price, recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Mr. Slavitt, for joining us today. I think, as has been said, I think we're moving in a better direction, but we still have a long way to go. And if we're going to make it so that physicians can once again be able to care for patients without an inordinate amount of influence or burden from outside, we've got to continue to work through this, and I appreciate your willingness to do so. I've got a couple specific areas and that I want to tick through. One is you've got moving from meaningful use to ACI, or whatever we're going to call it. You've got a 365-day rule. In the past, it's always been a 90-day rule, which means that practices have to demonstrate that they comply for a 90-day continuous period within a 365-day period. It only makes sense. Nobody is perfect every day, and if they're going to get dinged because they're not able to comply 1 day or 2 days or 3 days, then we've simply got to move to a 90-day, and I hope that you're able to work in that direction.
It's one of the key areas we're inviting comment right now during the comment period.
Good. So I invite comment as well from folks from whom I have heard.
Okay.
On the alternative payment models, you got a lot of folks out there, a lot of docs, guys and gals who have already modified what they're doing. The bundled payments, the BPCI programs, the future CJR program, and yet it appears that those programs that CMS has pushed on docs and encouraged docs, incentivized docs to do, don't even qualify for APMs. That doesn't make any sense at all. So I hope you're looking at just grandfathering those, or moving them in, or allowing them to qualify as APMs.
So, Congressman, one of the things that I think we have to do now that the law is being implemented is to go back and look at all of our models and see where we can make changes to them so that the participants in them can qualify. And I know that Dr. Conway is very much directing the team to look for ways to do that where possible. That has to meet, there are certain requirements that have to be met. An example would be, what percentage of the patients I'm seeing are part of this bundled payment? And so that, because that's in the statute and in the law, we have to look at how we can modify these programs or work with you on what our flexibility is to be able to
I agree.
do that.
If you expand the ability for them to use their entire practice instead of just Medicare, that oftentimes gets them to that point. So I would urge you to look at that.
Okay.
Docs are really frustrated with things for which they are being held accountable that they have no control over. One of them is on the meaningful use ACI issue, this data blocking that's occurring by the vendors. Mm-hmm. Docs don't have any control over what the vendors do at all. So how we can have a system that actually punishes docs, or potentially punishes docs, because of something that somebody else does that they don't have any control over, again, that doesn't make any sense at all, and they're pulling their hair out trying to comply with this. So if you can look at that, that would be appreciated as well.
Will do.
I want to touch on the nominal risk that you talked about.
Okay.
The nominal risk, as I understand it, is 4%, minimum of 4% of total spending to be qualified under an APM.
That's correct.
And as you know, the physicians control, I don't know, pick your number, 14, 15, 16% of total spending. So 4% of total spending is really 25, 30% hit for the docs. So how can we have a system that punishes the people that are where the rubber hits the road, trying to care for these patients, and again, for which they have little control over? That shouldn't that be 4% of the physician total reimbursement?
So one of the areas where we're looking for feedback on the comment period is both what is nominal risk quantitatively. We chose a number that was consistent across the MIPS program, but that's just in the proposal. So we would,
Doesn't that presume that the physician controls every dollar of spending?
right, and that's the second area that we seek feedback, which is in under what universe total cost of care, which of course the benefit of a total cost of care is a primary care physician has the opportunity to get rewarded for being able to keep their patient out of the hospital when they don't belong there and so forth. Of course, as you point out, the challenge with that as well. So it is an area where we're looking for feedback and very much hear your perspective.
A lot of those things are out of their control.
Sure.
We'd like to believe that they control them, but in an ideal world, that might be nice, but a lot of those things are out of control. I've got a few seconds left, and I just want to point out, once again, the table that you identified, Table 64, which by your own data stipulates that solo practitioners are going to, 87% of solo practitioners are going to see a negative adjustment. This is your own data. Granted, it's 2 years old, but it's going to be 2-year-old data that's going to reward them in 19 based upon what happens in 17. So I would urge you to relook at how you're adjusting that and in real time providing an update.
Right, and we're going to look in the final rule at having the most updated and most accurate information in that table. Again, while that table would not be good news for reality, I don't believe it is reality. However, I will say that, and the silver lining is, I think drawing attention to the impact of this regulation on small and solo practices is a good thing. And so I think it's where we need to have dialogue. And so despite the fact that I don't think that table represents the reality, I do think that the reality of how difficult it is to practice medicine in a small or solo practice is very real. And so we're looking for ways to make sure we make it better.
Great. Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. I think you might be sensing a theme up here. Mr. Blumenauer, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate the opportunity to have the conversation today. Mr. Administrator, appreciate the approach that you folks have taken to help us turn the corner. I personally have found the charade we went through for some 17 years kind of embarrassing, dancing away from an event we know nobody had any expectation should happen. We were dealing with a budget fiction. I think the agreement that was struck is reasonable. There is still much value to be squeezed out of the system, but I appreciate the fact and some of the references from my friend Dr. Price. We've got people who are in the middle of practice patterns, limitations on data, and just a whole host of other changes taking place. And I appreciate the commitment to do so in a thoughtful and deliberate fashion. You have also heard another theme emerge that people are keenly interested in making sure that we make this transition to rewarding value over volume, and that we've had problems in the past with some things theoretically. I mean, I have strongly supported Medicare Advantage, but at the same time, the parts of the Affordable Care Act to try and coax more value out of it, because theoretically it should enable us to deliver care more efficiently, and we continue to have a pretty significant premium. The compromise that was struck, and one that I thought was healthy, was to provide bonuses based on performance, and try and deal with some of the areas where there is some decidedly, I don't know if one want to call them outliers, but there's some real performance problems being overcompensated, coming from one of those regions that we like to think that if everybody practiced medicine like they do in my congressional district, we wouldn't have the funding problems that we have. I'm looking at charts like this that kind of display how it's supposed to work over time. I wonder if you can just give us a sense of where you think the pinch points are, where will be some of the things that we need to be prepared to be able to work with you if there's further adjustments legislatively, if there are things that we need to do a better job of just being able to understand ourselves, to explain to our community at home. Where are the pinch points that you think we need to zero in on?
Thank you, Congressman Blumenauer. I think I point to a couple of areas that I think are really critical focus areas for us. One is the education and communication process, particularly with smaller practices and individual solo physicians. it's vital that we hear their feedback and understand what the impact of the decisions that we're making here today will be on their practices several years from now. So that education process, I think, means a couple of things. One is that we talk in plain English instead of acronyms, which we are quite guilty of here, I know, but we're trying very hard to do a better job at that. We've created simple fact sheets and training sessions and PowerPoint and as many options as possible to do that. And if to the extent that you can help us do that and tell us what you're hearing, that's going to be critical. The second thing that I think we will need to continue to hear from you all on, and I think the conversation with Congressman Price is apropos to this, is where there are places where you think there should be flexibility and how we should be exercising flexibility, whether it's with smaller practices or whether it's in how we define the models that qualify for the 5% bonus. And in all of those areas, your feedback on our interpretations are critical, because we really do want to get to the best answer. And I'll tell you that we don't have a monopoly on that. We want to do that through the dialogue and the debate that Congressman Roscom referred to. And we also are going to have to make this an ongoing commitment, because we'll have to look at this program at the end of its first year and understand what worked well and what didn't, and what could work better. And we can't be afraid to call out the things that didn't work as well and sit down together and try to figure out how to make those things better, whether it's with technical improvements or whether it's simply in how we're implementing things.
Mr. Chairman, I do appreciate the opportunity to get into something which I hope we're able to periodically update, review. I appreciate part of this is process and part of it is performance. And being able to strike that balance in a way that's protective of the people who depend on the service, but also for the taxpayer, I think is going to be a challenge for our friends at CMS and for the committee. And I hope we can continue sort of zeroing in that fashion. Thank you.
Thank you. Well said. Mr. Smith of Nebraska is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Administrator Slavitt, for being here today. I represent a very rural district, in some parts more rural than others, in fact. 75 counties touching 6 states. Obviously, we're very spread out. #1 agriculture district in the nation, very productive. Of the nearly 60 hospitals in my district, about 54 are designated as critical access. And that might be a single designation, but that's about 54 different types of expertise and providers, and I'm actually inspired by the work that they do, serving communities from smaller than 1,000 up to about 12,000 plus. Nonetheless, they've got a very large task, and I guess so do you. Can you discuss the feedback you received from rural providers in response to the initial RFI, and how you address that in producing the rule, and then what rural providers and critical access hospitals can expect from this rule?
Yeah. Thank you, Congressman. And in your district, and I think throughout the country, we face the challenge of not having enough physicians, in many cases, enough specialties, and there are many districts around the country where there are only 1 or 2 providers in certain specialties. So we cannot allow the sideshow that goes along with the practice of medicine to make the practice of medicine less fulfilling and less rewarding. So as it relates to the small physician practices, the medical home models that many of them are participating in, we've had really terrific feedback from, and I think what I hear from small physicians is give us the opportunity, find ways for us to have the opportunity to participate in some of these same opportunities and models that people do in urban settings, and make them work for us. So can you make changes to them that can work for us? That's, I think, one of the things we hear. And then on critical access hospitals, obviously for us, so many of our Medicare beneficiaries get taken care of and get treated and rely on those critical access hospitals. And the economics of healthcare in rural America is different than it is in other places. And that is both a short-term issue that we have regulations, as you know, to set up deal with, but it's also a longer-term question around how those hospitals are structured, what they provide, and how we support them in the appropriate way.
Okay. In your response to the chairman, you had mentioned a reporting exemption for small providers. At the same time, I've heard questions from those who fall below the reporting threshold who would like to be able to report data. Will they have that opportunity?
So it's interesting you say that. I had that feedback last night in talking to a specialty society who said, we want our specialty to be more engaged in the practice of medicine with seniors. And so even our physicians who are only seeing small amounts, we want to do that. So I will tell you, I have heard feedback in both directions that I think our job will be over the comment period to take all that in and figure out how to do the best job accommodating the most types of practices possible.
Okay, well, I appreciate that. I know that the providers that I talk to are constantly not just to saying what the problem is, but to providing solutions and innovations, and I would hope that we can empower providers to care for their patients without the government getting in the way or messing things up. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you. The former mayor of Paterson, New Jersey is recognized. Mr. Pascrell for 5 minutes.
Good. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Administrator Slavitt, under your leadership, CMS has stressed the importance of better data to improve quality, to improve outcomes, and has made great strides in making that data available. MACRA included a provision that allows innovators to use QE data to help us make smarter decisions. Do you agree that the medical devices used in care, and I'll focus in on that, particularly for the most common Medicare procedure, joint replacements, play a role in healthcare quality and outcomes? Medicare has no information on the medical devices implanted in Medicare beneficiaries. I think we should let that settle in for a few seconds. Extremely problematic, I think, from an oversight perspective, and most importantly, from a safety perspective. You and I have had discussions. There is a history here that we need to address. So shouldn't this information be made available?
Yeah.
Administrator.
Thank you, Congressman. So the question you raise is really one of should there be and how should we capture a device identifier in a unique way on every device. And I think that's the goal. It's a goal that we share. It's a goal that the FDA shares. And it's critical for post-market surveillance to be able to understand the safety of how these devices work. So there are several, I think, critical things that we can do and are doing and are trying to do to make this possible. So despite our enthusiasm for this, this is an issue that's long preceded me. As you know, it's been an issue for quite some time. There are a number of parties who have a say in the matter of how this happens. I think as a first step, we're moving forward with the incorporation of a unique device identifier into electronic health records. I think this is a strong step, particularly considering the dramatic growth in electronic health records. But I know that there's also an interest that on claim forms, that there is a way for providers to provide care to indicate the device identifier on the claim form. We think that also has merit, particularly from a research perspective. I think there are a couple of issues to making that a reality. One is the committee that essentially designs the claim form, which is made up of a wide group of participants in hospitals and physician groups. Second is making sure that if we, as CMS, are given the charge to do this, that we can fund it and have the funds to do it operationally. And then the third, there will be an education and training process, because the history is that physicians don't automatically put the information they need to down on a form unless it's critical to them getting paid. So I think we need to work through all these issues with you. We've pledged to do this with your office, and we're working closely with the FDA to find the best path forward.
I think you've used the best word, critical. But if we don't do it this time, then we got to wait another 15 years before we change those forms. And our seniors will not be well served. This is important. I've been frustrated with CMS's resistance to what I believe is a very important priority, particularly of safety, including the unique device identifiers on health insurance claims. In order for the UDI to be added to the claims form as part of the next update, it would go into effect, I think, in 2021. That's the soonest. We need to act now. And I think I can't stress enough, Mr. Chairman, that we're talking about the safety of the people who use these devices. And we all want to be on the same page. This is, I think, a good time for us to address this issue. Number of cases, number of anecdotal stories about not only seniors, by the way, but we're talking about seniors here because we're talking about Medicare, that have had the problems. And we need to address that in order to improve safety. I mean, everybody on this committee talks about it, and I believe them in their hearts. And here's a chance for us to do something about it. But I want to thank you, Mr. Slava. You've done a great job, and thank you for putting up with us, but we're not going away. Thank you.
Thank you, Congressman.
Thank you, Mr. Pasquarello. Ms. Jenkins, recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Mr. Administrator, for joining us today. Medicare obviously plays an important role for many Kansans. It's the largest payer for medical services in America and life-saving benefit for many people. Last year, over 485,000 Kansans had health coverage through Medicare. We were pleased MACRA passed last year in a bipartisan manner. With the passage of MACRA, we repealed SGR and instead put in place what will hopefully lead to a better reimbursement system for physicians. Mr. Slavitt, the relationship between a physician and a beneficiary cannot be underscored in importance, and I believe this is especially true when talking about seniors. With the moves that MACRA makes towards higher value care centered on the quality of care administered by clinicians, it's ever important to ensure that we encourage greater and greater communication around decision-making between the doctors and their patients. So as MACRA's implementation continues over the next several years, do you see room to begin including patient activation measures, placing greater responsibility on this relationship with the hopeful result of shared responsibility over healthcare maintenance and thus furthering the quality of care?
Yes, thank you, Congresswoman, for that. I think that's a really important question, and I think there is an opportunity over the next several years to begin to incorporate those engagement measures in. There are a few things that are in the current proposal that I would point to that take steps in that direction. One is there is a practice improvement focus opportunity on the creation of a joint care plan between a patient and a physician. Secondly, in the advancing care information area, there are opportunities that focus on measures around how patients and physicians are communicating using technology and making sure that information is being made available to patients electronically and through other means. But I think this is as you point out, a ripe opportunity in a brand new area of focus for more patient engagement. We have been meeting with a number of patient groups as we've been putting this work together, and that's an important area of feedback for us.
All right, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Davis is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Let me welcome you, Mr. Slavitt. I know that you spent considerable growing up time in Evanston, Illinois, which isn't very far from my district. And I also know that your mother lives in my district. And I'm pleased to tell you that I have not had any real complaints from her. and so that makes me feel good.
That makes one of us.
But let me compliment you on your work. Medicine is a very complex environment, and there's tremendous complexity. And I also want to thank your staff. I have 24 hospitals in my district, 4 large medical schools, a number of research institutions, and a very activated citizenry. So we get lots of inquiries, lots of calls for assistance, a lot of calls for clarification. And so we spend considerable time not pestering, but certainly inquiring of your staff. And I want to thank them for the kinds of sensitivities they have displayed. I also have a very activated medical community, physicians associations and organizations. And just last week, I had a meeting with the Chicago Medical Society. But I've heard concerns that under the proposed rule that we're talking about, only a limited number of physicians will meet the alternative payment model or APM criteria to earn the payment bonus. By your own estimation, you have indicated that there may be only 30,000 to 90,000 physicians who meet these terms, which is a tiny fraction of the total Medicare eligible doctors in the country. And I'm certain that we'll hear some more from these physician groups. And they'd like to know what could make it, or how likely is it that anything will make it easier for there to be more pathways to qualify for the APM bonus payments? And how can CMS improve the opportunities for physicians to meet the advanced APM criteria and achieve the incentives to drive better care that Congress intended? And would you consider additional pathways that qualify as advanced APMs to provide assistance for physicians who wish to enter the current model?
Thank you, Congressman. And my mother made me promise to tell you that she was a teacher at Howe and working with Principal Patek, who she knows that knows you well, and so she made sure I said this publicly. So I've delivered that for my mother.
All right, thank you.
And your question is an important question because it speaks to physicians. All physicians who participate in the Medicare program are going to have a significant opportunity to get rewarded and get paid for providing quality medicine, which is exactly what we hear from physicians that they want. Some physicians will have the opportunity to go further, and I think the law allows those physicians to get a 5% bonus if they participate in these advanced payment models. So our goal is not just to make the core program good, but to create as many opportunities for physicians as possible to move into these programs. And we can do that a number of ways. One of the important ways to do that is to simply create more models and more opportunities. We also have to make it easy for people to move back and forth if they choose to between programs, and I think that's one of the things that we're striving to achieve. And then, as we talked about earlier with Dr. Price, how do we also have to look at, are there ways we can take existing models and make them compliant with this new law? So we are going to work on all 3 of those avenues because it is a goal that for any physician that wants to move to one of these advanced care, advanced APM or care coordination models, that they have the opportunity to do so.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Former Mayor Marchant of Texas is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Slavitz, does the CMS have the resources to approve and implement the new alternative payment model proposals in a timely manner?
Yep, thank you. So I believe the question is, can we implement new models in a timely manner? And one of the things that we have to do, and the answer is yes, we do. We need to, in concert with the committee that was set up by the Congress, the PTAC, we need to receive proposals from physicians, because physicians can generate their own proposals for models and quality, and then work with them to, as rapidly as possible, test them and put them into action. It's one of the things that we have had the opportunity to work on over the last 6 or 7 years through the Innovation Center. It's something that we have gotten better and better at, and we are eager to get going with this committee to get as many models in as possible so that we can get more and more models approved. And I had a chance to speak with that committee and speak in front of that committee to try to encourage more model development.
And there's a deadline period, so you're confident that you can get all that done by the deadline?
Well, fortunately, this is something that will be ongoing. Okay. So as soon as we get models in, we can get them tested. But this committee, I believe, will be standing for a number of years. I'm not sure if I know the exact number of years, but it'll be ongoing because physicians will be able to continue to develop new models.
So the transition in governments that's coming up won't have any effect on this process?
No, the committee, the staff at CMS will work with the new secretary, whoever that is, and continue moving that forward very much with that. And I think there is, as I've heard today, and I think as we continue to hear, there is a strong bipartisan commitment and a strong commitment to this program and moving this forward. So I don't see any concerns at this point.
And just some input, in my district, I hear from 2 different groups, and this is concerning the new program where you basically are, let's say, a knee replacement or a hip replacement. You're basically going to fund a lump sum for that. I'm hearing from seniors who think that the doctors and hospitals are going to cut corners so that they'll make the most amount of profit and just hurry them through the system. And then I'm hearing from the doctors and the hospitals who are afraid that they're not going to get enough money to take the kind of care of their patients that they need to take care of. So I guess you've created a pretty positive, these 2 tensions that are working out there. And could you just make a comment about that?
Sure. I think what you're referring to is a new type of payment approach. It's new for Medicare, but it's been ongoing in healthcare for a long time. It's called a bundled payment. Yeah. And really the idea behind a bundled payment is so that everyone who's involved in a patient care, whether it's before they would have a surgery, the surgeon, the anesthesiologist, but also the people that take care of the patient afterwards, have an alignment to get on the same page, to provide a high-quality outcome, and to do it as a team. And so it's relatively new to Medicare. We've had good experience and good feedback so far, but as with anything new, we continue to look for feedback, for data, for experiences, and in particular, if there are beneficiaries in your district or hospitals or physicians in your district that have experience with the program, we would love to get them from you or your staff.
Well, the group that I hear from the most is the in-home health care people who feel like they're kind of at the tail end of the process, and that they may be the ones and they feel like they're the most cost-effective of all, yet they feel like at the end of that process there may be some shortchanging going on.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Lewis is recognized for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, for holding this hearing today. Mr. Administrator, thank you for being with us. Thank you for all of your great and good work. Can you talk more about what people on Medicare might experience as a result of this change in payment policy? How will smaller provider groups be impacted and the doctors who need help to get up to speed?
Great. Thank you. So I think the most important thing that we have an opportunity to focus on here is patient care and improving patient care. And I think the ways to do this are severalfold. First is this new legislation allows us to pay physicians more for providing higher quality care. And the objective is to do this in a way which allows the physician to define what they believe to be the highest quality care from a menu of options and reward them for achieving those benchmarks. And I think physicians have been asking for that in one form or another for quite some time. Secondly, though, it's important to do that in a way that frees up physicians to actually practice medicine instead of just keeping score. And too many programs result in a lot of paperwork and a lot of scorekeeping and a lot of reporting, and we need to minimize that by simplifying wherever possible. The role of small physician practices, which you also mentioned, is critical here, and as we mentioned earlier, we believe that small, solo practitioners have every opportunity to be just as successful as larger size practices, and our data suggests that that indeed happens so long as the smaller practices report. So that means we need to minimize paperwork. We've also put in place some accommodations for smaller practices, including some technical assistance, some additional models, and ways that they can get excluded from reporting if their volumes are too low.
Thank you. Furthermore, Mr. Administrator, this is a very large regulation, over 900 pages. It's pretty big. It's a lot to digest, a lot to understand. If you had to tell your doctor the highlights of these changes, what would you tell her? What will your doctor need to know to maximize benefits and avoid payment cuts?
Great. It's a great question, and it may be one of the most important things that I can communicate today. First of all, it's to keep focusing on patient care. There's nothing in here that should distract anybody from patient care, and in fact, it will make it easier by streamlining a patchwork of programs that are already out there today into something simpler. So that's first. Second is they'll have the opportunity to select goals that they believe are right for their practice, right for their patient population, and at some point in time, they'll have the opportunity to do that. Third, I think, would be that over time, there will be opportunities for them to participate in more advanced models, like the kinds you asked me about earlier. Fourth is they don't need to really worry about reporting anything until spring of 2018, and we will make it clear what needs to be done well before then. And then finally, the last thing, and this is more of my ask of them, is to provide feedback, whether it's to this rule, whether it's through the medical society they belong to, the state medical society, directly to us. We really need line physicians who are practicing medicine every day to give us their feedback on what works about this rule and what might be the unintended consequences.
Thank you very much. And again, I appreciate your effort, your great and good work, and thank you for being willing to serve.
Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Lewis. Mr. Paulson is recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman and Mr. Slav, it's great to see you here today. Welcome, rather than on an airplane, going back and forth to Minnesota. As has already been said, last year, both sides took a very historic action to move forward, finally get rid of the flawed Medicare payment formula based on the SGR and that wonder if we're going to fix it every 6 months or every year. And like any law, passage is just the first step, right? It's the implementation that has to be carried out and followed through. And so, and making sure that it's done correctly and so that we're achieving the intended results. I just want to thank you at the outset for working with physicians, working with patients, having that connecting dialogue with all the appropriate stakeholders, including members of the committee, to making sure that we're implementing it in the correct fashion. I do want to continue on the common theme and just mention at the outset that it is important to know that I continue to hear from folks back in Minnesota as well that aren't in large integrated practices, solo practices, small group practices, et cetera, that do have that concern. And as you mentioned, you want to make sure that they have every opportunity to participate. And I think they want that reassurance, and we just kind of need to keep monitoring that going forward. And I thank you for that. Let me ask you this question. I've also heard from a lot of physicians and doctors in Minnesota about the Meaningful Use program for electronic health records and how it doesn't do a very good job of taking into account the way physicians treat patients and use their electronic health care records. Is this rule the same old, or do you make real changes in how you are going to be encouraging doctors now to actually use their electronic health care records?
Thank you, Congressman, and I would agree that our district practices some of the best medicine. The Meaningful Use program is something that we took an extremely hard look at. We took a step back because the Meaningful Use program actually is responsible for helping to make technology pervasive in medicine, and that's a very good thing. We look back 5 or 6 years ago, most physician offices, most hospitals didn't have adequate information technology. Today, by and large, 97% of hospitals, 70% of physician practices have technology. But as we look at how to go forward, we spend a lot of time talking to physicians and hearing exactly what you said, Congressman, which is that the Meaningful Use program was focusing on making sure they were using their computers and not focusing on taking care of patients. We also heard that physicians want their technology to be more connected. They want to be able to get information back and forth from other physicians when they refer patients or from hospitals. And they're also frustrated that there isn't enough connectivity and the data doesn't flow as easily as it should. And so we've been asked to focus on, and I believe have focused on in this rule, changing the program so it becomes much more flexible, moves the focus to the patient away from the use of the technology, focuses on the interaction and communication, and allowing the free flow of data to move back and forth. And those are the areas that we emphasized. We look forward to the comments during the comment period about whether or not we've done that well.
Does it seem like the proposed rule, replacing meaningful use with this new category, right, advancing care information, right? We have all these different acronyms, but accounting for 25% of a physician's performance score in the first year, is that going to essentially be interoperability now for electronic healthcare information for vendors, for hospitals, for all the different actors and players, physicians and other providers? Is that the intent, that that information is going to be that widely shared, that readily available, not just being on the computer, but actually using the information?
That is the intent. I'll tell you, everybody has a job to do in that regard. If any of us here could wave our magic wand and make the healthcare system more interoperable, I think we would do it. But this really requires vendors to share data, to publish to what they call open APIs, to not practice what we talk about as data blocking, which the Congress has expressly asked that vendors not do. And physicians, to a large extent, are really a victim of what the technology allows. They all want to share data. I have not met a physician who, when they refer a patient, doesn't want to know what happened to that patient and get that back electronically. But it's the technology that really needs to do that job. We think in the EHR certification that just came out and in a number of the other activities, we think vendors are going to move in that direction. They need to move in that direction.
Good. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Appreciate it. You're back.
Thank you, Mr. Paulson. Thank you, Mr. Slavitt. One comment related to that is we can discuss this more. As you develop a final rule and the performance period begins on January of 2017, vendors are going to have a limited time to reconcile with this new rule, and then physicians are going to have to digest the new rule. So I hope that again, particularly for the small group, rural markets, I hope that you'll work with us to make sure that implementation is done smoothly. And related to that, I don't know if you think you have some authority in this area. So the gap of time between performance period and then the payment year for physicians is 2 years, yet the clinician reporting period is a shorter period of time. Do you think CMS has the ability, through rulemaking, the authority to change that a little bit?
Yep. So one of the things we do see comment is on are the proposed measurement periods and payment periods. What I will say is a couple things. One is we have 2 feedback periods built in so that one in the middle of 2017 and one in the middle of 2018 to provide information back to physicians. So there is a more current feedback loop. The second thing I'd say is because we've focused so much on reducing burden and reducing the number of measures and so forth, that is, we've had some feedback that people want to make sure that that starts as early as possible. We've had other feedback, of course, which tells us make sure we have enough time, make sure we have enough time to do the things we need to do, make sure we don't get penalized unnecessarily because we didn't have enough time. And to your earlier question, Mr. Chairman, if people will begin on the older technology and move to the newer technology, they will not get penalized for that. So we are making those accommodations, but of course, the purpose of the comment period is for people to tell us what are the things we missed? What are the things that could have an impact on someone's practice or on their patients that we didn't think of? And that's one of the reasons why, if there's an important message today to get out, is to please engage in the rule and give us the feedback that we need to hear.
Well, I can't thank you enough for coming today. As you can tell, in a bipartisan way, members have a lot of interest in this, and not just the subcommittee level, but the committee of the whole, as well as the Congress. And we really appreciate you taking the time and look forward to working with you and your team as you continue to develop this and ultimately put it into process the way that we all intended it to be, and appreciate the fact that you were so kind yesterday as well. Look forward to working with you. Hopefully we've treated you nice enough that you'll come back as we have this bipartisan concern about the way this unfolds. So as a reminder, any member wishing to submit a question for the record will have 14 days to do so. If any members submit questions after the hearing, I ask that the witnesses respond in writing in a timely manner. With that, again, thank you again, and this committee is adjourned.
Thank you. Hey, how are you? Yeah.
So sorry, I was just swamped. Thanks for reaching